Lillian figured trading the filth of Boston for the wilds of Montana would be her salvation. She just never reckoned on the danger having a face, let alone a name. Barrett Halloway was not just some man. He was a 7-foot fortress of muscle and old scars, holed up in a cabin nearly buried by snow. When he looked down at her shivering frame, he did not offer a kind word. He offered the cold, hard truth. "You are too little," he rumbled, his voice like rocks tumbling in a dry creek bed. "This winter will eat you alive." But Lillian was hiding a secret far darker than the storm howling outside, and she was fresh out of places to run. This is not just a love story. It is a story about survival, about lies, and about a love that had to be burned down to ashes before it could be built right. The train whistle let out a piercing scream that sliced through the frozen Montana air. Territory. It was late November 1885. The steam engine, a great black iron beast huffing gray smoke against a blank white sky, ground its way to a stop at the platform in Silver Bow. Lillian Moore clutched her traveling bag with a grip so tight her knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. She stepped down onto the wooden planks, and the icy wind bit clean through her thin wool coat. She was 22 years old, but in that moment, shaken and all alone, she felt like a little girl. She scanned the platform, her heart pounding a frantic beat against her ribs. She was looking for a husband, or, more to the point, the man who believed she was the wife he was waiting for. The letter in her pocket, crumpled and soft from being touched 1,000 nervous times, was addressed to a Miss Sarah Jenkins. But Lillian was not Sarah. The real Sarah was lying in a pauper's grave back in Boston, taken by the consumption. Lillian was the imposter who had swiped her identity to get away from a debt that could only be settled with her life or with her body. "You the mail order?" The voice did not sound like it came from a man. It sounded like it rose right up from the earth itself, deep and rumbling. Lillian turned and had to crane her neck up and then up some more. The man before her was massive. He was a mountain given the shape of a man. He wore a coat made from bear fur that made his shoulders look as wide as a wagon. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but she could still make out a thick, dark beard peppered with gray, and eyes the color of slate, hard, unforgiving, and cold. I am," Lillian stammered. Her voice sounded weak and pitiful in the wind. "Are you Mr. Halloway?" "Barrett." Halloway did not answer right away. He sized her up, his gaze slow and critical. He looked at her delicate little boots, completely wrong for the mud and snow. He took in her narrow waist, her slender wrists, and the scared little tremble of her bottom lip. He frowned, and a deep line formed between his eyebrows. "Sarah Jenkins." "Yes," she lied. The word felt like grit in her mouth. Barrett let out a breath that turned to white mist in the cold. "The agency said you were sturdy, said you were a farm girl from Ohio, used to haul in water and chop in wood." Lillian swallowed hard. The real Sarah had been all of those things. Lillian was a librarian's daughter who knew how to mend a torn page, not a fence post. I lost some weight. The journey was difficult." "You are tiny," Barrett stated, plain and simple. He stepped closer, and Lillian had to fight the urge to back away. He smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and wet leather. "The snow up at the pass is waist-deep on a regular man. It will swallow you whole." "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Halloway," she insisted, trying to pull her shoulders back. "We will see," he grunted. He reached out and snatched her heavy traveling bag from her hand like it was filled with nothing but feathers. "Wagon is this way, unless you plan on freezing solid right here on this platform." He turned and stalked off, his long legs eating up the ground. Lillian had to practically break into a trot to keep up with his heavy, thudding footsteps. The wagon was a rough, functional thing hitched to 2 massive Clydesdales that looked just as mean as their owner. Barrett tossed her bag into the back and then turned to help her up. He did not offer a hand. He just put his hands around her waist. Lillian gasped. His hands were enormous, wrapping almost completely around her middle. For a second, her feet dangled free as he lifted her like a little doll and set her down on the wooden bench seat. The sheer casual power of it was terrifying. If this man ever found out who she really was, if he found out she was a fake running from a powerful crime boss named Arthur Penhaligon, he could snap her in two without even breathing hard. "Wrap this around you," Barrett ordered, throwing a heavy buffalo robe over her lap. "It is a 4-hour ride. If you get frostbite, I am not the one cutting your toes off. I am not a doctor." "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the heavy fur right up to her chin. They rode on in silence. The town of Silver Bow vanished behind them, replaced by dark pine trees and towering cliffs of rock. The road got steeper, winding up into the Bitterroot Mountains. The air got thinner and sharper. Lillian watched Barrett out of the corner of her eye. He handled the horses with tiny little movements of the leather reins. He seemed to be a part of this land, brutal and silent and dangerous. "Why did you send for a bride, Mr. Halloway?" she asked after an hour when the quiet started to feel heavy. "You do not seem like a man who is looking for company." Barrett did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the trail. "I am not. I need a worker. Someone to keep the cabin, cook the meals, preserve the meat. A partner to handle the inside chores while I handle the outside. It is a business arrangement. Do not mistake it for anything else." Lillian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "I see. Do you?" He finally glanced at her, and his eyes were piercing. "Because looking at you, I think you made a mistake. You are shivering like a wet leaf. You are too small for this mountain, Sarah. And you are definitely too small for me." The way he said it, "too small for me," sent a hot flush right up her cheeks. It felt like a dare. "I can adapt," she said, her voice finding a sudden streak of steel. "I have nowhere else to go." Barrett grunted. "Everyone has somewhere to go unless they are running." Lillian froze solid. He was sharper than he looked. "We are almost there," he said, pointing a gloved finger upward. High above them, sitting on a ridge that looked like it could only be reached by something with wings, was a log cabin. It was dark, imposing, and completely alone. Smoke curled up from the chimney, the only sign of life in a huge, empty white world. "That is home," Barrett said grimly. "Hope you are ready to work, Sarah, because winter is hitting hard tonight." The inside of the cabin was basically one giant room with a stone hearth that was large, enough to roast a whole deer. The furniture was all oversized, clearly built by Barrett's own hands to fit his big frame. The table was made of thick timber. The chairs were wide and solid. Lillian stood in the center of the room, a puddle of water from the melting snow forming around her boots. She felt dwarfed by everything. The ceiling beams were low for the size of the room, making the place feel cramped despite all the open space. "Stove is there," Barrett said, hanging his coat on a peg that was much too high for Lillian to reach. He pointed to a cast-iron beast in the corner. "Stew is in the pot. Needs heating. Bread is in the box. I have to see to the horses." He left before she could say a single word, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. Lillian let out a breath that she could see in the air. It was freezing inside. She moved to the stove. She had seen stoves before, of course, but the ones in her father's Boston townhouse were taken care of by servants. This one looked like a sleeping iron animal. She opened the firebox. A few embers glowed faintly. She grabbed a piece of wood from the pile, but it was a heavy log that had not been split. She struggled to shove it in. She burned her finger on the iron door and hissed, dropping the wood with a loud clatter. "Useless," she whispered to herself, her eyes stinging with tears. "You are useless, Lillian." She finally managed to get the fire going after 10 minutes of fighting with it, getting her hands covered in soot. She found the ladle, but it was heavy iron. Everything here was heavy. When Barrett came back 20 minutes later, stomping the snow from his boots, he stopped dead in the doorway. He looked at the stove, then he looked at Lillian. She was just standing there, her face smudged with black soot, holding a bowl of lukewarm stew. She had tried to slice the bread, but the knife was dull and the crust was hard as a rock. She had ripped the loaf into ragged chunks instead of clean slices. Barrett walked across the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He looked into the pot. It is not boiling. I added wood, she said, trying to defend herself. You choked it, he said, opening the firebox. Too much wood, not enough air. You smothered the fire. He grabbed a poker and jabbed at the logs with a few hard, efficient movements. Flames instantly roared to life. He turned back to her, crossing his massive arms over his chest. I thought you were a farm girl. Farm girls know how to work a stove. It is a different model, she lied weakly. Barrett's eyes narrowed. He reached out and grabbed her hand. Lillian gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He was not hurting her, but he was impossible to move. He turned her hand over, palm up. He ran his calloused thumb over her skin. His thumb was rough as sandpaper, a shocking feeling against her soft, pale skin. No calluses, he murmured. Smooth as silk. These are not the hands of a woman who chops wood or scrubs floors. He looked right into her eyes, his face only inches from hers. Who are you? I told you I am Sarah, she insisted, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint. The Sarah Jenkins who wrote to me said she had a scar on her left palm from a sickle accident when she was 12. Barrett said in a low voice, You are missing the scar. A chill shot through Lillian that had nothing to do with the cold. She had never read all the letters. She had simply grabbed the bundle from Sarah's room after she passed away. Barrett let go of her hand like it was a hot iron. You are a liar. I do not know who you are or what your business is here, but I do not give shelter to liars. Please, Lillian pleaded, latching onto his arm. It was like holding onto the trunk of an old oak tree. You do not understand. I cannot return. If I return, I am a dead woman. I will learn. I swear I will learn. I can cook, I can clean. I will do anything you need. Barrett gazed down at her. She was a pathetic sight, swallowed up by her enormous wool coat, a smudge of soot on her face and pure terror in her eyes. He was a hard man, the kind of man who had left society behind just to escape the dishonesty of others. But he was not a monster. He could not throw a woman out into a raging blizzard in the middle of the night. You will stay tonight, he grumbled. In the morning, I'm taking you back to the train. No, she cried out. Please, just allow me a chance. You are soaked, he noted, ignoring her desperate cry. He gestured to the hem of her coat, which was dark with melted snow. You will get sick with pneumonia. Then I will have to bury you in frozen ground, and I despise digging in permafrost. He strode to a large chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a flannel shirt. It was red and black plaid, made of thick, warm material. He tossed it to her. It landed against her chest with a soft thud. Put this on. Dry your clothes near the fire. Lillian paused. Where do you want me to change? A dry, humorless laugh escaped Barrett. This is the whole cabin, Sarah. Turn your back if you are shy. I have seen a woman before. Do not think so highly of yourself. He turned his back to her and began to chop vegetables on a countertop with a steady thud, thud, thud. Lillian quickly shed her wet dress and undergarments, shaking violently in the drafty cabin. She pulled on Barrett's shirt. It was gigantic. The shoulder seams drooped halfway down her arms. The bottom hem reached her knees like a dress, and the sleeves went 6 inches past her fingertips. She buttoned it, the heavy fabric carrying his scent of cedar and musk. It was overpowering. I am dressed, she whispered. Barrett turned around. He stopped what he was doing. She looked ridiculous. She looked strangely charming. She looked impossibly small. He walked over to her. Lillian held her breath, staring up at him. He loomed over her, his sheer size seeming to steal all the air from the room. Look at this. His voice was a low growl, dropping an octave. You are swimming in it. He reached out his hand. Lillian flinched, but he only took hold of her left arm. He started to roll up the sleeve, his big hands surprisingly skilled. He folded the thick material until her small, pale hand was free. Then he did the same to the other side. He lowered himself to one knee, and even then his eyes were almost level with hers. He took the bottom of the shirt and pulled it straight, then grabbed a leather belt from the table. He wrapped it around her middle. He had to use a knife from his own belt to punch a new hole in the leather, because his waist was double the size of hers. He pulled it tight. The shirt bunched up, highlighting her slight figure inside the massive garment. He stayed kneeling there, his hands resting on her waist for a moment too long. The heat coming from his body was powerful. Lillian felt a nervous flutter in her stomach, a combination of fear and something she knew was forbidden. "You see," Barrett said, his voice rough as he stared at the point where the belt cinched her waist. "You are too small. Nothing in this place will fit you. Not the work, not the weather, not the clothes." He looked up, meeting her eyes. The force of his slate-gray gaze held her in place. But he stood up slowly, the motion emphasizing his incredible height. "For tonight, I will make it fit the other." Meaning of his words hung in the space between them, heavy and electric. He was not talking about the shirt anymore. "Eat your stew," he ordered, turning away from her sharply. "Then you can have the bed. I will sleep on the floor." "I cannot take your bed," Lillian protested, her voice weak. "The bed fits me fine," he said over his shoulder, "but the floor matches my current mood. Do not argue with me, little liar. My patience is wearing thinner than your coat." Lillian ate quietly, watching him. He sat by the fire, carving a piece of wood, the light from the flames dancing across his scars. She had made it through the first few hours, but she understood the real danger was not the snow. It was the man. And worse, it was the realization that when he had tightened that belt around her waist, she had not wanted him to stop. The wind that night did not just blow, it screamed. It was a physical attack on the cabin, smashing against the logs with a violence that made the heavy wood groan. Lillian lay in the enormous bed, buried under 4 layers of quilts and furs. Still, she could not stop shivering. It was not just the cold. It was the man sleeping on the floor 10 feet away. She peeked over the side of the mattress. Barrett was a dark shape in a bedroll near the fireplace. He had not stirred for hours. His breathing was slow and steady, as if he was completely untroubled by the storm outside. Lillian squeezed her eyes shut, trying to bring back the image of her father's library in Boston, the smell of old paper, the dust particles dancing in the sunlight. But the memory was spoiled by the thought of Arthur Penhaligon. She could see his gold-toothed grin, feel the heavy hand of his collector on her shoulder when her father's gambling debts were called in. "The girl has value," Penhaligon had said. That phrase had been her death sentence, or something worse. It was the reason she had taken the identity of a dead maid and run away to the west. A sudden, sharp crack sounded from outside, cutting through the wind's howl. Barrett was on his feet before the sound had faded. He moved with a quickness that seemed impossible for his size. In a single fluid motion, he kicked his blankets away and grabbed a Winchester repeater from the wall. He was shirtless, and the firelight cast long, dancing shadows over a torso covered in scars, burns, knife cuts, and the puckered star of an old bullet wound near his ribs. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "What is it?" Lillian whispered, pulling the sheets up to her chin. "Wolves. They smell the horses." He threw open the heavy oak door. The wind howled into the room, sending a swirl of snow across the floorboards and making the temperature drop by 20 degrees instantly. Barrett stepped out into the storm, bare-chested and barefoot, and vanished into the white chaos. Lillian sat up, her heart pounding. Bang! Bang! 2 shots rang out, their sound muffled by the wind. Then a silence fell that felt more oppressive than the storm. Several minutes passed. She thought about running to the door, but she was frozen by fear. Then he came back. He entered backwards, forcing the door shut against the powerful wind and securing it with a heavy iron bar. He shook the snow out of his hair like a great grizzly bear. "Are the horses safe?" she asked, her voice trembling. Barrett leaned the rifle against the table and looked at her. His chest was rising and falling slightly, shiny with melting snow and sweat. "They are safe. The pack will not return tonight. I killed the alpha." He walked to the hearth and threw a log on the fire, the muscles in his back moving like ropes. He did not seem to feel the cold. He seemed to be a part of it. "You should cover yourself," Lillian said, looking away, her face flushing with heat. Barrett snorted. "This is my house. I will dress as I want." He turned, wiping his hands on a rag. "But since you are awake, let us finish our conversation. You said your name is not Sarah. Who are you?" Lillian swallowed hard. The storm had them trapped together. There was no escape now. "My name is Lillian Moore." "Moore." Barrett repeated the name. "That is a city name. Boston." "Yes. And what is a lady from Boston doing hiding in a mountain man's cabin in the Montana Territory?" "I am running from a debt," she admitted in a quiet voice. "My father, he was a good man, but he had a weakness for card games. He died owing money to a man named Arthur Penhaligon." Barrett became completely still. The rag in his hand stopped moving. He slowly turned to face her. "Penhaligon," Lillian confirmed with a nod. "Do you know him?" "I know the name," Barrett said, his voice dark. "He controls the docks in Boston. He also runs the opium dens, a man who profits from misery." "He wanted me," Lillian whispered, the shame burning her throat, "to pay off the debt. He said I would have to work in one of his houses until the account was settled. I could not do that." Barrett looked at her, really looked at her this time. He saw the terror etched into her delicate face, the desperation that had sent her across the entire country to a place where she did not belong. He looked at her soft hands, clutching the rough wool of his blankets. "So, you stole a dead girl's life," he concluded. "Sarah was a maid in our home. She died from consumption 3 days before she was supposed to leave. She had no family. I took her ticket. I took her letter." "Fraud," Barrett grunted. "And dangerous. If Penhaligon has people searching for you, you have brought that danger right to me. I did not think they would track me this far," she pleaded. "Men like that always track you," Barrett said. He walked over to the bed. Lillian pulled back, but he only sat on the edge, the mattress sinking deeply under his weight. "The pass is snowed in," he said, his voice flat. 10 feet of snowdrift. Even with the Clydesdales, we cannot get down to the train station for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Lillian felt a rush of panic. 2 weeks. "You are trapped here, Lillian," he said, saying her real name for the very first time. It sounded both intimate and frightening coming from him. "You lied to get here. You are no earthly good for the work I got. You are just a burden." "I will go," she said, starting to climb out of the bed. "I will walk." "You will be dead in 100 yards, he shot back. He threw out a hand, blocking her way. His arm felt like a fence post. "Sit down." She sat. "You stay," he ordered, "because I am not having your death weighing on my soul. But you will earn your keep. You will cook, and you will learn to do it proper. You will mend, you will clean, and you will stay clear of me when I am working." "And after the 2 weeks?" she asked, her eyes lifting to his. Barrett straightened up, his huge frame making a shadow against the fire. "After the snow melts, I am putting you on a train to San Francisco, a long way from Boston, and a long way from me." He turned back to his bedroll on the floor. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins." Lillian laid back down, listening to the wind scream. She was a captive of the storm and a guest of a giant of a man who looked at her with a mix of irritation and something else, a heated, silent thing that scared her more than any wolf. The next 3 days passed in a haze of sore muscles and shame. Barrett was not a cruel man, but he was demanding. He lived by a hard rule of pure efficiency. where every motion had a reason and not a single bit of energy was wasted. Lillian, on the other hand, felt as clumsy as a calf in a potter's shop, even though she was barely the size of a teacup herself. The cabin was a fortress built for a man. Everything in it was heavy. The cast iron skillets took both her hands just to lift. The water bucket, when it was full, pulled her shoulder down so bad she walked with a lean. On the fourth morning, the sun finally cut through the gray clouds, lighting up a world of blinding white. "Laundry day," Barrett declared, tossing a heap of clothes onto the floor. "Creek is frozen solid. We will melt snow in the copper tub. Scrub them, wring them out, hang them by the fire." He headed out to chop wood, leaving her alone with the pile. Lillian got to it. Heating the water took a whole hour. Scrubbing the heavy flannel shirts and denim breeches was back-breaking work. But the real fight started with the wringing. She picked up one of Barrett's pairs of trousers. Soaking wet, they must have weighed 10 pounds. The material was a thick, unbending canvas. She twisted with all her strength, her small hands sliding on the slick, soapy cloth. A little water dribbled out, but the pants stayed heavy with it. She clenched her jaw, braced her foot against the side of the tub, and pulled with a grunt. The door creaked open. Barrett stomped inside, his arms loaded down with firewood. He stopped dead, just watching her. Lillian's face was flushed red, and she was panting, wrestling those wet trousers like they were some kind of wild animal. She twisted and yanked, letting out a growl of pure frustration. Barrett dropped the firewood into the bin with a loud crash. The whole floor shook. "Move," he grumbled. "I can do it," she snapped, refusing to let go. "I am not helpless." "You're going to rip the seams clean out before you get the water out," he said. He reached down, his hands covering hers. They were so big they swallowed hers and the fabric whole. "Let go, Lillian." She finally released her grip on the garment. Barrett picked it up. With a single easy twist of his wrists, a stream of water poured out of the denim, splashing back into the tub. He gave it another twist, and the veins on his forearms stood out like thick rope. He gave the trousers a hard snap, and they looked nearly dry. He hung them on the line. Then he grabbed a shirt. Twist, snap, hang. In 2 minutes, he did what would have taken her an hour. He turned back to her. She was just standing there, wiping soap suds from her brow, looking completely defeated. "I told you," he said, his voice a bit softer than usual. "Physics does not give a damn about your stubbornness. You do not have the leverage." "I hate being useless," she whispered, staring at her red, raw hands. "In Boston, I could read Latin. I could play the piano. Here, I cannot even wring out a pair of pants." Barrett just looked at her. He could see the pride she was clinging to so hard. He took one step closer. The air between them crackled, suddenly thick with something new. "You are not useless," he said. "The stew last night, it was edible." "The stitches are crooked," she argued, thinking of his mended coat. "But they hold," he shot back. He reached out and caught her chin with his fingers. His touch was rough from work, calloused but surprisingly gentle. He tilted her face upward. "You are small," he said, his thumb brushing against her bottom lip. "Everything out here is too big for you. The mountains, the trees, this house. Me." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "You do take up a lot of room, Barrett." "And you take up none," he murmured. "I could probably fit you in my pocket." He stared down at her lips. For a long second, Lillian was sure he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. She wanted to know what it felt like to be completely swallowed up by him. But then he pulled back, his jaw clenched tight. "I'm going to check the trap lines. Stay inside." He snatched his coat and was gone. 2 hours later, Lillian was sweeping the floor when she spotted something through the window that turned her blood to ice. Down in the valley, about a mile off, a lone rider was pushing his way through the deep snow. A horse with a black saddlebag. She grabbed the spyglass Barrett kept on the mantelpiece. Her hands were shaking so bad she could hardly focus the lens. The man wore a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was not from around here. Local folks did not ride alone in snow this deep unless they were on a hunt. Then she saw the shine of a badge. Panic shot through her. A marshal, or one of Penhaligon's men, pretending to be one. Barrett got back 10 minutes later, 2 rabbits hanging from his belt. He saw her face as pale as the snow outside. "What is it?" "Someone is coming," she gasped. "A rider. He has a badge." Barrett let out a curse. He went to the window and took the spyglass from her. He watched for a full minute. "That is no marshal," he said, his voice grim. "That is a bounty hunter. I know his kind. They buy fake badges to get folks in town to cooperate." "Is it him?" she asked. "Penhaligon? Maybe. Or maybe you are just worth good money to somebody else." Barrett turned to face her. "Listen to me. If he comes up this mountain, you are not Lillian Moore. You are not Sarah Jenkins." "Who am I?" "You are my wife," Barrett said, and the words landed with the force of an anvil. "We got married in Silver Bow 3 months ago. You are shy. You do not talk much." "My wife? It is the only way he will not drag you off this mountain," Barrett said. A husband has claims on his wife that some fellow off the street just does not have. And since you are with me now, he will have to deal with me first." He moved over to the gun rack on the wall. He lifted down a smaller piece, a .22 caliber rifle that was good for hunting rabbits. "We are going outside," he stated plainly. "What for? Why? If you are going to be my woman, you have to learn how to handle a firearm and not look scared doing it. He is going to show up in about 20 minutes. That leaves us 15 minutes to get you ready." The 2 of them stepped out into the biting cold. Barrett found an old tin can and balanced it on a fence post. "All right, bring it to your shoulder," he instructed. Lillian raised the rifle to position. It felt heavy in her hands, but not as cumbersome as the Winchester. She tucked the stock firmly against her shoulder. "Spread your feet a little more," Barrett advised. He stepped in right behind her. His broad chest made firm contact with her back, a solid wall of warmth against the chill. His arms came around her, wrapping around her until she was completely encircled. He gently shifted her hands to get a better hold on the forestock. "Let those shoulders drop," he murmured, his beard scratching softly against her ear. "Take a breath and let it out slow. Now squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." Lillian found it nearly impossible to concentrate on the distant can. Her every thought was consumed by the man behind her. She felt his solid frame, smelled his clean scent, and felt how his body enveloped hers like a sturdy shield. She whispered his name. "Barrett." "You need to focus, Lillian," he rumbled. But his own voice sounded tight. "Everything depends on this moment." She took the shot. The bullet flew wide of the mark, sending up a puff of snow. The kick from the rifle sent her stumbling backward, right into his solid chest. He did not budge at all, taking the force of the blow easily. "Do it again," he said firmly. They kept practicing until a sharp ping echoed from the can. "That will have to do," Barrett declared. He took the rifle from her hands. He spun her around to face him. They stood chest to chest. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and impossible to read. "When he gets here," Barrett said, "you stand behind me. You hold on to my arm. You act like you belong to me." Lillian looked up into his face. "I think I can do that." "Good." Barrett glanced down the trail. The rider was visible now, just a black spot moving up the white switchbacks. "His name is likely Kincaid," Barrett said, spitting the name out like it was poison. "I saw the brand on his horse through the glass. He's a tracker out of the Dakotas, a real bad sort." Barrett's hand came to rest on the huge Bowie knife at his hip. "Go on inside. Put the coffee on. Make it look domestic. And Lillian," she paused at the door. "Leave the top button of that shirt undone," he said, his voice gone rough. "Make him believe we did not just meet." Lillian's hand drifted to her collar. She undid the button, showing the hollow of her throat where her pulse was jumping. She met Barrett's eyes across the room. "I trust you, Barrett," she said softly. "Do not," he answered grimly. "I am a man, not a saint, and we are about to play a dangerous game." The knock on the door was not really a knock. It was a heavy, commanding thud from a gloved fist. The sound echoed in the small cabin like a gunshot. Lillian stood by the stove, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had unbuttoned the top of her flannel shirt, just as Barrett had told her, revealing the pale, frantic flutter at the base of her throat. She was gripping the handle of the coffee pot so hard her knuckles had turned white. Barrett stood in the middle of the room. He did not look scared. He looked like a statue carved out of granite. He motioned for her to stay where she was, then walked to the door. He did not open it right away. He slid the little wooden peephole cover to the side. "Who is it?" His voice was a deep and unwelcome rumble. "Shelter for a traveler," a muffled voice called back. "Storm is picking up, friend." Barrett slid the heavy iron bolt across. The metal let out a screech that set Lillian's teeth on edge. He pulled the door open, his massive frame completely filling the doorway. The man standing on the porch was covered in snow, but his eyes were sharp, already scanning the room over Barrett's shoulder. He was a lean man with a face that looked like it had been cured in tobacco smoke. He had on a long duster coat, and, just like Barrett figured, the man had a tin badge pinned to his vest, though it was looking mighty tarnished. "The name is Kincaid," the man announced, offering a smile that held no warmth at all. "My horse threw a shoe about a mile back, and I saw your smoke." "This ain't a boarding house," Barrett grumbled, not bothering to step out of the doorway. "I can see that plain enough. I just need a place to warm my bones for a bit. Unless you are planning on leaving a lawman to freeze solid." Barrett sized him up for a long moment, then grudgingly moved aside, letting the man pass. "Your boots, leave them by the door." Kincaid stomped the snow off and stepped inside. His gaze landed on Lillian almost immediately. It was the look of a predator, a slithering stare that crawled over her body and made her feel exposed. "Well now," Kincaid drawled, pulling off his hat to show a head of greasy hair slicked back. "I did not know you had company way up here, big fella, and such pretty company at that." Barrett shifted his stance. It was a small movement, but it put his body partly between Kincaid and the woman. "That is my wife, Sarah." "Wife, you say?" Kincaid lifted an eyebrow. He sauntered toward the fireplace, rubbing his hands together to get the feeling back. "I do not see a ring on her finger." Lillian's heart stopped. She was not wearing one. "We were married by a traveling preacher over in Silver Bow." Barrett lied without a hitch, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "We did not have the money for gold. This mountain is our church. You got a problem with that?" "No problem at all," Kincaid said, turning his backside to the flames. "It is just that I am hunting for a young lady about her size, a runaway from Boston, who goes by the name Lillian Moore. She took a whole lot of money from a very powerful man." Lillian willed her body to move. She poured a cup of coffee, her hand shaking just a little. She walked to Barrett, avoiding Kincaid's eyes, and handed the mug to her husband. "Here is your coffee, Barrett," she murmured, keeping her head bowed. Barrett accepted the mug, his big fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you, my dear." He took a long sip, his eyes fixed on Kincaid. "My Sarah is from Ohio. She has been here 3 months, since before the first snow fell." Kincaid let out a low chuckle. He took a step in Lillian's direction. Barrett's shoulders tensed up, making him look even bigger. "Let me see your hands, miss," Kincaid said, his voice deceptively soft. "She does not take orders from you," Barrett snarled. "Just checking, friend, the girl I am searching for has hands as soft as silk. She never did a lick of work in her life. A farm girl from Ohio would have calluses." Kincaid moved faster than a striking rattlesnake. He snatched Lillian's wrist. Lillian cried out and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He forced her palm upward. Her skin was red from doing the laundry, but underneath the redness it was smooth. It was the hand of a lady. Well, well, Kincaid grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. These hands have not seen much farm work. Before Kincaid could utter another word, the world turned upside down. Barrett had moved with a horrifying speed. His hand, as big as a dinner plate, wrapped around Kincaid's throat. He hoisted the bounty hunter clean off the floor and slammed him hard against the log wall. The whole cabin trembled from the impact. "I already told you," Barrett roared, his face just inches from Kincaid's. "She is my wife. I do not let her toil in the fields. I treat her like a queen. You lay a hand on her again, and I will snap your neck like a dry twig." Kincaid made choking sounds, clawing at Barrett's arm while his legs kicked helplessly in the air. The difference in their strength was staggering. Barrett held him there with no effort at all, his eyes burning with a cold and deadly rage. "Barrett!" Lillian shrieked, afraid he was about to kill the man. "Barrett, please stop! You are going to kill him!" Barrett held him for 3 more terrible seconds, then let him go. Kincaid crumpled to the floor, coughing and gasping for breath. "Get out!" Barrett commanded, pointing a finger at the door. Kincaid scrambled to his feet, rubbing his throat. His cocky attitude was gone, replaced by a hateful, wounded stare. He backed away toward the door, snatching his hat from the floor. "You are making a big mistake, Holloway," Kincaid rasped. "I know who you are. I saw that scar on your chest. You are the Union Army deserter, the one they call Iron Holloway. There is a price on your head, too. Am I right?" Barrett did not even blink. "Get out!" Kincaid yanked the door open, letting a blast of wind inside. "I am leaving, but that pass is snowed in. I will be making camp down at the tree line. We will just see how long you can keep her safe." He slammed the door behind him. The silence he left behind was heavy and loud. Lillian looked at Barrett. He was breathing hard, his hands clenched into tight fists. "Deserter, she whispered." Barrett turned to face her. The fury seemed to drain right out of him, leaving him looking worn out and much older. "I did not desert. I refused an order to burn down a hospital filled with wounded soldiers. They called that treason. I called it being a decent man." He walked to the window, peering out at the dark figure of Kincaid disappearing into the blizzard. "He is not gone for good," Barrett said softly. "He is going to circle back. He smells a payday. 2 bounties for the price of 1. He turned back to Lillian, his face grim. "Put on your warmest socks. We cannot stay in this cabin tonight." "Where can we possibly go?" Lillian asked, her voice shaking. "It is a blizzard out there. If we stay here, he will try to burn us out in our sleep," Barrett said. "The man is a coward, and cowards love to use fire. We are going to the root cellar." The root cellar was a hole dug into the hillside 50 yards from the cabin. It was made to keep potatoes from freezing, not to shelter 2 people. The wind outside was a raging force, nearly knocking Lillian off her feet. Barrett had to carry her the last 20 yards, using his own large body to shield her. As sharp ice pelted his face, he kicked the snow away from the trapdoor, pulled it open, and carefully lowered her down into the blackness. He climbed in after her, pulling the heavy door shut and bolting it from the inside. The change was sudden and complete. The howling gale was instantly reduced to a distant, dull hum. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth. Barrett struck a match, and the brief flare of light showed a space no bigger than a large closet. Barrett sat down, his back flat against the dirt wall. His legs were bent at a strange angle because the cellar was just too small for a man his size. "Come here," he ordered, his voice echoing in the confined space. "We have to share body heat. If we try to sleep apart down here, we will freeze to death." Lillian carefully sat down between his powerful thighs, with her back pressed firmly against his wide chest. He wrapped his arms all the way around her and pulled the thick buffalo robe over both of them. It felt like being held by a great bear. His heart beat against her spine with a slow, powerful rhythm that helped to calm her own frantic pulse. They sat like that in the dark for a very long time. The closeness was overwhelming. Back in the cabin, there was always space between them. Down here, there was nowhere to go. Every time he took a breath, she felt it move through her. Did you really save all those men? Lillian asked quietly into the darkness. The ones in that hospital? They were dying men, Barrett answered, his voice thick and gravelly. My commanding officer wanted to burn the place down just to save on ammunition. I broke his jaw and headed west. I have been on the run ever since, just like you. We are quite a pair, are we not? Lillian whispered. The giant of a man and the woman who is a fraud. Barrett's arm tightened around her waist, hidden beneath the robe. You did a good job today with the coffee. Your hand was steady. But when he grabbed you, when he put his hands on you, I wanted to tear him to pieces. Lillian turned her head, straining to see his face in the complete darkness. Why? Because, Barrett's voice dropped, becoming rough with feeling. You are mine. I said it to fool him. But when the words came out, they did not feel like a lie. Lillian's breathing caught in her throat. She shifted her body in his arms. It was a clumsy movement in the cramped space, but she managed to turn until she was straddling his lap, with her knees on the dirt floor. It was the only way she could face him. Even sitting down, he was still taller than she was. Barrett, she whispered, her hands reaching up to cup his face. You are too small, Lillian, he groaned. His hands were big enough to span her entire waist, his thumbs pressing into her ribs. I will break you. I am a mountain, and you are just a delicate flower. I am not a flower, she said with a fierce tone. I am the woman hiding in a hole in the ground with a wanted man. This space, he rasped, it is too tight. Then make it fit, she challenged him. Barrett let out a low growl and pulled her tight against him, closing the final inch of distance between their bodies. His mouth came down on hers. It was not a soft kiss. It was a hungry kiss. It was the blizzard outside, but brought inside of them. Lillian gasped and opened up to him. She felt a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the buffalo robe. She felt safe and completely consumed and strangely powerful. He finally broke the kiss, burying his face in the curve of her neck. If we make it through this night, he whispered against her skin, I am not letting you go to San Francisco. I do not want to go, she confessed, holding onto his broad shoulders. I want to stay here on the mountain. You can teach me things. I will teach you, he promised. But first, we have to take care of the rat that is outside. A sudden noise from above made them both freeze. It was a scraping sound. Scrape, scrape. Somebody was digging at the trap door. Barrett's body went rigid as stone. He reached down to his boot and slid out his massive Bowie knife. He found us. You stay behind me. He cannot get it open, can he? Lillian whispered, the terror rushing back into her. No, it is barred from the inside, Barrett said. Then he paused. But he can block our air vent. As if summoned by his words, the small, faint draft of fresh air that came through a pipe in the ceiling suddenly stopped. Kincaid was piling snow on top of the ventilation pipe. He is going to suffocate us, Lillian realized, her voice climbing with panic. We have about an hour of air in here, Barrett estimated, his voice steady. He is waiting for us to throw open the door, desperate for air. Then he can shoot us like we are fish in a barrel. What are we going to do, Barrett? He slid the knife back into its leather sheath and gently moved her from his lap. Then he went over to the corner of the root cellar, running a hand along the damp wall. I made a small runoff tunnel, he explained. It leads out the side of the hill. It is tight and packed with mud and ice. He used his boot to push aside a pile of moldy burlap sacks, showing a little dark opening that was barely 2 feet wide. He glanced at the hole and then down at his own frame. His shoulders spanned a good 3 feet across. The harsh reality struck them both in the same instant. I cannot fit, Barrett said, the hope draining right out of his voice. He looked over at Lillian. But you can. I cannot go without you, Lillian whispered, a cold fear gripping her as she stared at that dark, muddy gap in the earth. You have to, Barrett rasped. The air in the cellar was getting thick, and the flame on their match began to flicker as the oxygen dwindled. He tried to force his arm into the runoff tunnel, but his broad shoulder wedged tight against the frozen dirt right away. The very escape route he had designed was now his prison. He was just too big. "I built this to keep the cellar dry, not to escape," he growled, yanking his mud-covered arm back out. He put his hands on Lillian's shoulders, his grip almost painful with urgency. "Now you listen to me. You are going to crawl out of here. You will run for the tree line. Consincade will wait, thinking we are running out of air. Then he will lift that door. By that time, you will be long gone." "No," Lillian cried, and her tears turned to ice on her cheeks. "I am through with running." "Lillian, you look at me," Barrett roared, his voice booming in the tiny space. "I am going to die in this cellar. I have made my peace with that. But I will not stand by and let you die with me. You are small, and that is what will save you. Now go." He picked her up and pushed her feet towards the opening. "Barrett," she sobbed, glancing back at him one last time. His face was set with a grim determination, and beads of sweat were forming on his brow. "Go," he whispered, and his voice finally broke. "And when you make it, find yourself a man who fits." She turned and began to crawl into the darkness. The tunnel was a living nightmare. It was so narrow her shoulders scraped the sides, while the low ceiling caught on the roots above her and freezing mud pulled at her legs. The blackness was so complete, it felt like being buried alive. "You're too small," she remembered Barrett's voice saying. "No," she muttered through gritted teeth, pulling herself forward one painful inch at a time. "For this, I am the perfect size." Her lungs were on fire, but then she spotted a pale gray light up ahead. With a final burst of strength, Lillian clawed her way forward and tumbled out into a deep snowdrift concealed by juniper bushes. She took a huge breath, and the freezing air felt like fire in her lungs. She lay there in the snow, shaking, and looked back toward the small cabin. Consincade was sitting on a wooden crate right on top of the trap door, puffing on a cigar. He was humming a little tune, just waiting for the quiet from below to tell him the job was done. Lillian knew she could not just run. If she ran, Barrett would die. That is when she saw it. Consincade's horse was tied to the porch rail, and sticking out of a leather scabbard on the saddle was the stock of a repeating rifle. Lillian started to move. She carefully made her way across the top of the deep snow, where a bigger person would have sunk right through. She got to the horse, her heart pounding inside her chest. The horse shuffled its feet, but Lillian pushed down her fear. She pulled the rifle from its scabbard. It was heavy, and it made a cold, metallic sound as it came free. Consincade spun around. "Who is out there?" Lillian fell into the snow, steadying the heavy weapon on the porch railing. It felt too big for her, the stock awkward against her shoulder. She saw Consincade get up, stepping off the trapdoor to look around the yard. "Come on out, little girl," he yelled, pulling out his revolver. "I know you're not down in that hole." Lillian did not aim for Consincade. She knew her hands were shaking too much to make the shot. Instead, she aimed for the lantern that was hanging on a porch post right above a pile of rags soaked in kerosene. "Squeeze, do not pull," she fired. The rifle bucked hard, slamming into her collarbone, but the bullet hit the iron hook holding the lantern. The glass exploded, dropping the burning wick right onto the kerosene. The whole porch went up in a sudden roar of fire. Consincade shouted, throwing an arm up to shield his face from the intense heat. The horse panicked and galloped away into the trees. "You little witch!" Consincade screamed. He saw her in the snow and raised his revolver, firing a shot that sent ice flying just inches from her head. Lillian scrambled backward, fumbling to work the heavy lever on the rifle. Consincade came toward her, a dark shape moving against the dancing flames. "I am going to kill you first, and then I will drag his body out." He was only 10 feet away when the ground right behind him erupted. with Constance no longer sitting on the crate. The trapdoor blew open, sending splinters flying. Barrett Halloway clawed his way out of that hole like a bear woken from its slumber. His face was bluish from the lack of air, and his eyes were wild. He sucked in a huge breath of air and let out a roar that seemed to shake the forest. Constance whipped around, his eyes going wide with disbelief. How? Barrett did not waste a second. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Constance fired one wild shot that hit Barrett in the shoulder, but the big man barely seemed to notice. Barrett crashed into Constance like a runaway train. They both went down in the snow. Constance tried to use a knife, but Barrett grabbed his wrist. There was a sharp, ugly crack, and the bounty hunter screamed in pain. Barrett lifted the man by his coat and heaved him clean off his feet. He threw him into a deep snowbank at the edge of the ravine. Constance struggled to get his footing, but the loose snow gave way. He fell backward, sliding down the steep, icy bank toward the frozen river far below. His screams got quieter until the wind carried them away. Barrett stood there breathing hard, with blood trickling from his shoulder. He turned slowly and looked at Lillian. She was still holding the rifle that was far too big for her. He dropped to his knees, completely spent, and reached out a hand to touch her cheek. "You came back," he rasped, looking at her as if he could not believe his eyes. "You stubborn, wonderful woman." "I told you," Lillian whispered. She let the rifle fall and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I am through with running." Pulled her close, hiding his face in her hair. He was freezing and bleeding, but to her, he felt like the only safe place in the entire world. "You saved me," he mumbled into her neck. "You are so small, but you saved me." The spring of 1886. By May, the last of the snow had melted, leaving the mountain alive with green pines and blankets of purple wildflowers. Lillian stood on the porch in a dress she had sewn from blue calico material. It fit her just right. From inside the cabin, she could hear Barrett humming while he fixed a wobbly table leg, a quiet sound of peace she never expected to find. He came outside, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he looked much healthier. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm sort of happiness. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "The mail rider came through this morning," Barrett said. "He left a letter from San Francisco. It says Arthur Penhaligon is dead. He was shot during a card game." Lillian let out a long, slow breath. The last shadow from her past in Boston finally disappeared on the mountain wind. "So," Barrett said, holding her a little tighter, "that makes you a free woman, Lillian Moore. No more debts, no more bounties. The train leaves tomorrow. You could be anywhere you want to be." Lillian turned around in his arms to look up at him. She put her small hands on his chest, right where his heart was beating. "I tried to put on my old boots yesterday," she said in a soft voice. "And, well, they do not fit me anymore." She gave him a little smile. "My feet have gotten tougher. I reckon I am stuck right here." A wide grin spread across Barrett's face, making him look 10 years younger. He bent down and gave her a slow, sure kiss that felt more like a promise than a question. "Good," he rumbled against her lips, "because this mountain feels mighty empty without you now. You might be small, Lillian," he said, and he lifted her up easily, setting her on the porch railing so they were at the same height. "But you sure do fill up all the empty spaces." Lillian laughed and wrapped her legs around his waist. She was finally home. "I told you, Barrett," she said, "I would find a way to make it fit." And that is the story of Lillian and Barrett. She went from being a frightened bride-to-be with a dangerous secret to the woman who was strong enough to save the giant of the mountain. It just goes to show you that a person's size is not about how much room they take up in the world, but about how much fight they have in their heart. Lillian proved that even the smallest person can open the biggest door, and that sometimes the things in life that do not seem to fit can turn out to be a perfect match after all. Now I have to ask you all, what would you have done if you were Lillian? Would you have run for your life, or would you have stayed to fight for the man who stood up for you? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I promise I read every single one of them. If you like this Western romance story, please do me a kindness and hit that like button. It truly helps this channel out more than you know. And do not forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you will never miss out on a new tale. Thank you for listening, and I will see you all in the next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.